Hello there, I'm John Brolly the Storyteller, and I'm here today with the Dracaena Centre to bring you a very old tale for all the family, although parts of it are a little bit scary, so be warned. This story comes from Cornwall, from a little village called Curie. It's the story of a fisherman whose name was Luty. Now Luty was a happy man. Every day he'd go out in his boat and he'd bring home a catch full of fish. And then he'd go back to his little cottage where his wife and his boy were waiting for him. His boy was only 2 years old when the story begins. But he wasn't a happy boy. In fact, he'd been ill all of his life, and he'd never even learnt to smile. Luty would go over and kiss his head, and feel his fevered brow, and look at his little red cheeks. Doctors had been in, but doctors in those days didn't know their salt, and they'd say, "Luty, this lad isn't going to grow up to be a man." Luty didn't quite have everything, but he did have a lot. He had his boat that he went out fishing with, he had his wife and his cottage, and in the evenings he took his old dog down to the beach, and he'd throw sticks and stones and the dog would chase him, and they'd look around in the pools, sit on the rocks, and they were happy. Until one day things changed. One day Luty went out fishing as usual, came home, kissed his wife, kissed the fevered brow of his little boy, and then headed off down to the beach. Now for some reason, and it does this from time to time in Cornwall, for some reason the mist just rolled in from the sea. And when the mist rolled in, it wasn't a light mist, it was thick, it was dense. You could barely see your hand in front of your face. And Luty was walking far out on the sand, for it was a spring tide, which meant the sand was spread right out into the distance. The sea was far away. He said to his dog, "Come on, boy, we better get home, or we will find ourselves lost." And just at that moment, as Luty turned to walk away, he heard the strangest sound he had ever heard in his life. It was part human, part animal. You could mistake it for singing, or a wailing, or a crying, or a keening. But Luty didn't know what it was. He turned and looked up. It was as though something or someone was calling to him. And in the sound that floated in the mist, it seemed to be saying his name. Luty, Luty, Luty. Now Luty didn't know what to do. He grabbed hold of his old dog and said, "Boy, what are we going to do? Should we head back to our cottage? Or should we turn into the mist and see where that sound's coming from?" The old dog looked up at him with big eyes, and Luty knew what he had to do. Somebody or something was calling to him. Somebody or something might need a bit of help. And so he turned and he walked into the mist, following the sound of that keening or crying that was calling to him. It wasn't long before the sound started to grow, louder and stronger. Luty was tripping over the rock pools and getting his feet wet as he went, but he was fixed. He was following that sound. And then finally, as the sound grew to a crescendo, keening and calling his name, he came to a pool with a large rock rising out of the middle of it. At the top of that rock, just peeping up over the top, you could see the back of someone's head sitting on the other side of the rock. Now the hair on that head wasn't like mine or yours. It was matted greens, oranges and reds. It was almost like it was made of seaweed. But that's where the sound was coming from. Luty edged his way quietly around the pool to the other side of the rock so he could get a glimpse of who was sitting on the other side, singing and calling and saying his name. When he got round there, he saw the most beautiful creature he had ever seen in his life before. It was a girl. That orange, reds and green hair fell over her porcelain shoulders, fell over all her body, which was a good job, for underneath that hair she was stark naked. Her skin was so white, so clear, it was almost like you could see right through it. And her teeth, when she smiled, were white and broken, but beautiful. And then he looked into her eyes. Her eyes were like green pools, and as he stared into them, they grew. And he felt he could almost dive in and swim around that green pool. And then she smiled again, and Luty looked down a bit embarrassed. And when he looked down, he could see she was sitting in the water. And beneath the surface of the water, he could see that, blow me, she had no legs. And instead of legs, she had the tail of a fish. Now, Luty knew about this sort of creature. This is the siren. This is Morvoran. This is the creature that all fishermen fear. For she looks into your eyes and she calls to you. And if you follow her call and look back into those eyes, then you are hers forever. For that is how she finds her husbands. Luty knew he was in trouble and took 2 steps backwards, splashing in the water as he went. Morvoran, he said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look into your eyes, but you cannot take me. I am Luty the mermaid. I'm Luty the fisherman. I need to get back to my cottage, to my boy and my wife. You cannot take me. And Morvoran smiled at him. Luty, you know who I am. I am Morvoran the siren. And you have looked into my green eyes, so you are mine. And I can take you whenever I want. Luty's fear was filling his whole body, but he stared back into those green eyes and said, no, don't take me. I've got a little sick boy at home who needs me. I've got my dog waiting for me on the beach. She smiled again, that broken white smile, and she said, Luty, I've not come to take you now. I've been calling to you, for I need your help. Luty, I'm sitting in this pool, and the sea is far out. Now, if I don't get out to the sea and swim in the waves, my children will surely die without me. I need someone who will pick me up and carry me out. And if you do that for me, Luty, in return, I will leave you here. Not forever, but for 12 more years. 12 more years to be walking on the sand with your dog. 12 more years fishing. 12 more years with your wife and your little boy. That's no good for me. He says, 12 12 years isn't enough. I'll hardly see that boy grow up to be a man. I'll help you, but in return I want more. And you can give me more. I know you can, for I know that you creatures of the sea can grant wishes. Morvaran smiled at him and looked at him again. We can, Luty. We can grant wishes. But what would you do with a wish? You humans, you'll ask for a big house, horses, land, and what good will that do you? Luty drew himself up tall and said, no, I want a wish, all right. I'm not wishing for anything like that. I got everything I need. I got my boat, my cottage, I got the sand and my dog and my wife. What more could I ask for? Oh no, you grant me a wish, and I will wish to have the power to heal the sick, for I know you can do that, Morvaran. I know the stories of what you can do. Morvaran smiled at him again and said, you are a good man, Luty. I will grant you this wish. But in 12 years' time, I will come back, and you will be mine. Now you must lift me from this pool and carry me through the mist across the sand and take me to the sea. All right, said Luty. That sounds like a deal. He bent down and he put his arms around that naked creature and lifted her up. Now, blow me, he was shocked when he lifted her, for she weighed no more than a newborn babe. And as he lifted her up, her pale and slender arms entwined around his neck, and he could feel her fingers in his hair. As he held her close, he could feel her cold breath on his cheeks, and he looked into those big green eyes, and he smiled at her, and she smiled back. And a little piece of Luty's heart was gone forever. That beautiful creature sang and sang as he carried her across the sand. In his ear she sang a song of life beneath the sea, of living with the crabs and the narwhal and the lobsters and the dolphins. And those dreams flowed inside him like wine as he walked towards the sea, his little dog waiting behind him. And then his feet splashed into the water, and he smiled again at Morvaran and said, here we are, I'll put you down now, my job is done. Morvaran looked back into his eyes and said, no, Luty, this isn't deep enough. Take me a little bit further. Take me further, where it's deep enough for me to swim, and I will find my children. All right, said Luty. And he carried on walking, and as he walked, she carried on singing. And as she sang, he felt himself drawn into a trance, so that all he could hear was her voice, and all he could see was a place beneath the waves where the shipwrecks lie in the sand and the seaweed and the shells. Then the water rose up to his waist. But this time he didn't ask to put her down. This time he didn't stop walking until the sea rose up to his chest. And this time he kept on walking. And she kept on singing, and he was drawn deeper and deeper into the waves till the water rose up to his chin, and it was splashing across his face, and it looked like Luty was going to disappear beneath the waves. When suddenly his old dog, who had been waiting faithful on the sand by the edge of the water, suddenly realised his master was in mortal peril, and he began to bark and howl and yelp and leap about in the shallows. Luty heard that barking, he shook his head, and he felt the water splashing over his face, and he looked down at Morvaran in his hands. And he said, "You tricked me, Morvaran. You tricked me!" And he started to push her away into the waves. But Morvaran looked back at him and smiled, and her fingers that were entwined around his neck began to grip tighter and closer and squeeze his neck and pull his head towards him. And he could see the sea coming up towards him. He waved his arms around, splashing for help, but there was no help. And then he put his hand in the pocket of his old sea coat, and he found his iron fishing knife. And as he cried and he shouted, and as the water began to wash over his head, he lifted that knife high above his head, and he cried out, "Morvaran! By the power of this iron, release me!" And he brought that knife down with all his might into the water. For Morvaran was gone. The last he saw was her face and those big green eyes smiling at him as she dipped beneath the waves and was gone. Despite everything, she took a whole piece of Luty's heart with her. He splashed his way back to the sand and he hugged his old dog, and the two of them laughed together and cried together on the sand. And they slept that night on the sands, cuddled up together. Next morning, when he went back to his cottage, his wife said to him, "Where have you been?" And he told her the story. She didn't believe him. She thought he was drunk, been out with his friends. But then Luty went over to where his little boy lay in that cot, his fevered brow, sobbing and crying. And he laid his hand on that little boy's head. And for the first time, that boy stopped crying. And for the first time in his 2 years, that boy smiled. And you could feel the fever rising up for him and floating around the room and heading out the open doorway. Luty had the power to heal the sick. Word soon spread around, and it wasn't long before there was a queue of people at Luty's cottage waiting to be healed. And Luty laid his hands on them and healed them, one after the other. And the next day, there were more people queuing up. Word got around to the whole of the Lizard, to the whole of Cornwall, and people would head over there, and Luty would heal them. It got so he didn't even have time to go out in his boat and go fishing. Every day he would heal the sick. Every day people would come. And then, in the evening, every day, he'd go down to the sand and throw stones for his dog to chase. But now, someone else used to come along as well. His young boy, who was growing big, healthy, and strong. And the two of them would throw stones and sticks for that dog together. They'd walk hand in hand, happy. He grew up to be a fine young lad. And then, just after his 14th birthday, things changed again. For they spent the day healing the sick as usual. And then they walked down to the sand. And from nowhere, the mist rolled in. And when the mist rolled in, Luty heard a sound that he had heard 12 years before. A crying and a keening and a calling sound that seemed to be saying his name. Luty turned round to his little boy and he looked him in the eye and he said, "Lad, my time has come. You're the man now. I have to go." Luty turned and walked into the mist, and that lad never saw him again. You might think that's the end of the tale, but no. That boy watched and waited for his dad to return, but Luty never came back. In the end, he took the dog home, and he said to his wife, to his mother, "Dad's gone. He's left." He walked into the mist. Luty's wife smiled and said, well, part of his heart was there already. It was time for the rest of his body to join it. The next day, someone knocked at the door to be healed, but Luty wasn't there. So the boy didn't know what to do, so he laid his own hands on the sick person. And blow me, if he didn't have the power to heal the sick as well. And I'll tell you something else that's true. There's still a Cornishman living in Curie today, a descendant of Luty's, who has the power to heal the sick. And folks who know will go along and be healed. And I'll tell you something else that's strange. Every 12 years, to this day, a descendant of Luty has gone down to the beach and disappeared into the mist. No one knows for sure where they've gone, but I think they're there with Luty and his beloved Mavoran, swimming beneath the waves with the dolphins and the crabs among the shipwrecks and the sand. And that is the story of Luty and the Mermaid. Thank you very much.